On this episode of Taking Into Account, is it crazy to think that Windows 11 could run on Linux? Don't be so quick to dismiss this. Also, the Ubuntu devs detail their plans for 32-bit support in Ubuntu 19.10. Also, there's a new Linux cryptocurrency malware that's out there. These stories are becoming way too common now. What's the deal with this? Also, the Raspberry Pi 4 is a big step up in power from previous generations of the Raspberry Pi, but is it good enough to replace your desktop or laptop? Is it good enough to do everyday work? Also, trashed computers, laptops, phones, they hurt the environment. Smartphones more than any other device. Can Linux help solve this environmental disaster? These are 5 stories that I will be taking into account. And the first story on the docket tonight is this story from Computer World, written by Stephen J. Von Nichols. Quote, "Call me crazy, but Windows 11 could run on Linux. Desktop Windows has had so many problems, desperate measures may be needed." So what Stephen J. Von Nichols is talking about is Microsoft really loves Linux these days, right? Microsoft hearts Linux. They're all in on open source. They're all in on Linux. And because of the problems that the Windows operating system has had in the past few years, maybe Microsoft will eventually quit basing Windows off of their own NT kernel and instead move to the Linux kernel. Now that's kind of crazy, right? That's really off the wall, but is it? As Windows 11 gets nearer, Microsoft has kind of been laying the groundwork for such a radical change, if you think about it. For one thing, think about the problems Microsoft Windows has had recently. Just in the last couple of years, and we had this massive registry backup fail. We have numerous Windows updates that did not go well. Some of them were crippling to people's machines. Some of them actually broke people's machines, these Windows 10 updates. So they were so bad that some of the updates, people were saying, don't take the updates. They stayed on older versions of Windows 10 rather than taking the security updates, which, of course, not taking the security updates leaves your machine vulnerable to attack. But people were risking that rather than taking the upgrade because the upgrade path was so dodgy, right? You didn't know if it was going to break your install. Also, it seems like Microsoft has kind of moved Windows to the back burner, right? They no longer focus that much on their desktop operating system. They want you and your company to move over to the Windows Virtual Desktop now. They want you to replace all your PC-based software, all your desktop clients like your Microsoft Office suite. They want to replace all that with software as a service programs like Microsoft Office 365, for example. They want you to start using their web clients. So it's obvious, right? Nobody in Redmond cares anymore as far as the operating system, the quality of it. The operating system really doesn't matter as more and more of these software as a service programs are being pushed by Microsoft. So do they even need Windows? I mean, do they need to build their own operating system? And if they do they need to keep building their own custom kernel, the NT kernel, when there's a perfectly good alternative, actually a much better alternative out there in the Linux kernel? Think about all the security problems Windows has. Those security problems don't happen at the desktop user level, right? This is low level stuff, right? It's kernel level stuff is the security issues with Windows. Simply by replacing the NT kernel with the Linux kernel, most of Windows security problems go away almost immediately. So that is one of the real benefits, actually, if Windows ditch the NT kernel for the Linux kernel. Now, the desktop consumer wouldn't know any difference. They don't know anything. They don't know what kernel is in your operating system anyway. When they sit down at a computer, they just know what it looks like. Windows can still look and function like Windows regardless of the kernel. So to the end user, it wouldn't matter at all, but for security, it would be a big upgrade for Windows to switch to the Linux kernel. As far as Windows-only applications, that's the one thing people will say, well, there's so much software out there that only works on Windows. Well, not as much as you think. We have things like Wine, Crossover, Play on Linux. We have Valves and Steam with Proton. Proton, of course, lets these Windows-only games work on Linux, but it doesn't just have to be Windows-only games. It could be other software as well that could potentially one day run on Proton. And of course, if Windows got behind this, Windows could ensure that we get more compatibility with Windows-only software on Linux. So I don't think that's a big problem. We also have the Windows subsystem for Linux already out there. Windows already has Linux kind of built into it. This was for developers that, needed Linux to work inside Windows. We already have that. So this seems, again, like a natural progression. I don't think this is far-fetched at all. I could see Microsoft eventually making a Linux-based Windows operating system because, again, this isn't the old Microsoft that was anti-free software, anti-open source, anti-Linux. Linux is a cancer. No, this is not that Microsoft. This is not your dad's Microsoft. This is the new and improved Microsoft. So I don't think this is a crazy idea at all. I think this is actually a real possibility. And the next story on the docket tonight is Ubuntu devs are detailing their plans for 32-bit support in Ubuntu 19.10. So this is kind of a big deal because those of you that haven't been following this story the last few weeks, Ubuntu initially planned to drop 32-bit support. Starting in Ubuntu 19.10 and going forward, they were no longer going to support 32-bit software on that distro. And they changed their minds rather quickly because of the community outcry. Much of the community did not like that idea at all because there's so much software out there that is 32-bit software, especially games. It would have killed Ubuntu as a gaming platform. One of the big gaming platforms out there, the biggest actually, of course, is Steam. And the maker behind Steam, Valve, told Ubuntu basically they would no longer support Ubuntu. They actually recommended Ubuntu as the operating system, the Linux operating system. If you wanted to run Steam on Linux, you needed to run Ubuntu. And they were about to just disavow themselves from Ubuntu completely over this because Steam was no longer going to work on Ubuntu if you didn't include all these 32-bit libraries. So the Ubuntu devs, they heard the message, they reversed their opinion, but they still don't want to maintain the entire 32-bit archive, right? There's just too much cruft in there that nobody uses. So the plan is no longer to maintain that entire 32-bit archive, but instead they just want to maintain the most popular packages, the most often used packages, and those critical dependencies used by some of the most often used programs on your computer. So they're going to make sure that things like Steam and Wine work. They're going to have those packages in the repositories. Quote, based on our commitment to continue to support i386 user space in Ubuntu, we have assembled a list of packages that we have been able to determine there is a demand for. So anything there's a real demand for, they're going to keep maintaining. Anything that has very specific niche user cases, they're no longer going to maintain. It's not going to be in the repos. So again, Steam is going to run just fine. Wine, most of your stuff will work just fine. If you have some weird use case, you need some weird 32-bit library for some weird 32-bit program that is like a really small, like a corner case. Yeah, you're going to be out of luck. At least it's not going to be in the official repositories. But you know what? You can probably go get all that extra 32-bit stuff package as a snap package or some other third-party package. So you can still get that. You're just going to have to jump through some hoops. But those of you that were worried about things like Wine and Steam and Play on Linux, things like that, Lutris, all that stuff is going to be just fine. Starting in Ubuntu 19.10, you're still going to have all your 32-bit libraries for all that stuff there. So I'm really glad Ubuntu reversed their opinion on this. I mean, when the community speaks, you do need to listen, and I applaud Ubuntu for reversing that decision. And the next story on the docket tonight is there is a new Linux cryptocurrency mining malware out there yet again. I cover so many of these stories on taking into account. Every other week, there is a new crypto mining malware out there. Why? Why is this such a big deal? So anyway, there's this new Linux mining malware out there. Basically, it's a rootkit that's being used by SkidMap to hide its cryptocurrency mining activities. It hides it. It doesn't want you to know it's mining for Bitcoin. And, it wants it all to be done unbeknownst to the user. Also, there is a stat here. Cryptojacking campaigns and ransomware attacks have increased by 29% in Q1 2019. Think about that. Almost 30%. Cryptocurrency, cryptojacking campaigns, ransomware attacks have increased by 29% in Q1 2019. Wow, that is an explosion in these kinds of attacks. Why? Why is this so popular? So first, the crypto exploit here was recently announced in a Trend Micro post, and quote, that they have come across new Linux malware. The analysts reported in the security intelligence blog that the malware loads malicious kernel modules to hide its cryptocurrency mining operations. Again, it hides its activities. You won't be able to fire up HTOP and see a process there that says Bitcoin miner or anything like that. No, it hides all that because it wants to do all this in the background. It wants to suck up your processing power of your computer to mine for Bitcoin for the hacker, but it wants to do this in a way that you don't know about it, because if you knew about it, of course, you'd format the drive and reinstall, you'd just stop all of that. So it only works if you don't know about it. So it sets up this way to gain backdoor access to your machine, and then, quote, it also replaces the system's PAM_Unix.so file with its own malicious version. So it replaces that file with its own file under that name, but that file is not really that file. That file is the cryptojacking malware, right? So the point of cryptojacking is this malware is used to acquire access to your computer. It wants your computer's processing power. It wants to use your computer's CPU or GPU. It wants to use your system resources to mine for Bitcoin or whatever cryptocurrency it wants to mine for. And because of the nature of cryptocurrency, the fact that it has to use computer processing cycles to make that currency, that is the problem. That's the reason we get all these attacks. Fundamentally, cryptocurrency is designed for these attacks. It wasn't designed with these kinds of attacks in mind, but when you design cryptocurrency to use CPU cycles and GPU cycles to make the currency, the natural progression of things is hackers are going to want to take over a bunch of machines, everybody's machines. They want to take over as many machines as possible, because the more machines I have control of and I have mining for Bitcoin, the more potential money I could make. So just the nature of cryptocurrency itself has led to this problem. I don't know if we can solve this problem without a fundamental restructure of the way cryptocurrency works. Otherwise, I think we're just going to have to deal with this problem. I don't think there's really any way to combat this problem, because as long as cryptocurrency needs somebody's computer or your computer's CPU and GPU to make the currency itself, there's always going to be people out there that are going to want to take over your machine. And the fourth story on the docket tonight is, can a Raspberry Pi 4 replace your desktop? Is it powerful enough, the Raspberry Pi 4, is it powerful enough to replace your desktop or your laptop to do everyday work? So this article comes from ZDNet. It's written by J.A. Watson. So the Raspberry Pi 4 is a step up in power from previous versions of the Raspberry Pi. We had the original Pi, then we had the Pi 2, then we had the Pi 3. I actually own a Pi 3, great device. And now we have the Raspberry Pi 4, which again is a bit of a step up as far as specs. So now with the Raspberry Pi 4, are we finally to the point where the Raspberry Pi is a viable desktop replacement? So if you look at the screenshot here, those of you watching the video, he's opening up LibreOffice. He's got a file manager open. He's got a terminal open. It looks like he's got his package manager open, and he's got GIMP open, all in this screenshot. So it looks like he put it to the test, right? So the first test, if it's going to be a replacement for your desktop or your laptop, is software. Can I get all the programs I want to run on a Raspberry Pi? Now this problem is an easy one to solve. Yes, you can get every program you run on your desktop or laptop on a Raspberry Pi if you choose the right Linux distribution. So the most popular one for the Pi is probably Raspbian. Raspbian GNU/Linux, what is that? Well, that is a spin of Debian. Debian has huge repositories. Everything you could possibly want is probably in the Debian repository. So just by running the right Linux distribution on your Raspberry Pi, yes, you have all the software you could possibly want. It's going to have the apt package manager, the apt package manager, the standard Debian package manager. So you're good on software. That's not a problem. Performance, though. Performance is where things get a little tricky. So the previous versions of the Pi were very underpowered devices, but to be fair, the Raspberry Pi 4, even though it's got a little bit better specs than the previous versions, the Raspberry Pi 4 is also underspec. It is not a powerful device by any means. They offer 3 different models. I think they offer a 1 gigabyte, a 2 gigabyte, and a 4 gigabyte model. And we're talking about the RAM here. J.A. Watson here in the article, he decided to start off with the 1 gigabyte model Raspberry Pi 4. And he mentions he was able to run both LibreOffice and GIMP simultaneously without any trouble on the 1 gigabyte version of the Pi. Fantastic. That's great. But then he added, as soon as he decided to open up Chromium, the Chromium web browser, while having LibreOffice and GIMP running, that's when the trouble started. Basically, nothing worked at that point. Yes, the problem here is the web browser. So the modern web is very, very bloated. Modern web browsers are also very, very bloated. You're pushing over a gigabyte of RAM oftentimes just by opening up the web browser. So obviously a 1 gigabyte Raspberry Pi model is not going to be acceptable for standard web browsing. It's just not. These very minimal Linux distributions that are out there, things like Puppy, things like Antix, yes, they can run on as little as 256 megabytes of RAM. The operating system itself runs just fine on 256 megabytes of RAM. Most of the programs you launch will be just fine on 256 megabytes of RAM. You cannot open up Firefox or Chrome on 256 megabytes of RAM. You need over a gig. And some of the websites you go to, just to render them properly, they need more than a gig of RAM. They just do. So the 1 gigabyte model probably not going to be acceptable as far as a desktop replacement. But when J.A. Watson here decided to move it up a bit to the 2 gigabyte version of the Raspberry Pi 4, things were just fine. 2 gigabytes was just fine for GIMP, LibreOffice, and Chromium. It was using about 1.3 gigabytes of memory of the 2 gigs, so that's just fine. CPU usage was quite high, but that's to be expected. It has to use most of the CPU. He was using 60 to 70% of the CPU, but it's not a very powerful CPU. It's always going to be that high. It just is. Then he tried the 4 gigabyte version of the Raspberry Pi, and the 2 gigabyte version was fine. The 4 gigabyte version was just fine too. That's more than enough RAM to do anything. Now, we mentioned CPU. The CPU is always pegging, 60, 70%. Sometimes as high as getting close to 100%. CPU heating and cooling is a problem with these single board computers, these small form factor computers like the Raspberry Pi. They get hot. So the Raspberry Pi 4, he was getting temperatures ranging from 80 to 85 degrees constantly, 80 to 85 degrees Celsius. That's very warm. That's a hot CPU. Can you do much about it? Not really. So you don't really have any cooling in the Raspberry Pi. There's no fans or anything. Also, the case itself, if you build a case or you buy a pre-built case, it's designed to be a very small form factor. That's the point of these devices. There's no airflow. So they get hot. They just run warm. There's really not much you could do about it. I guess you could try to do some kind of custom cooling, but the minute you start adding a fan, or if you tried to do any kind of running some kind of liquid cooling to it, it requires a much bigger case. A much bigger case, why are you running a Raspberry Pi? You should have just bought a proper computer at that point. Another consideration is the fact that the Raspberry Pi doesn't have a power on or a power off switch. That, to me, doesn't seem like that's a bigger a problem. I have a Raspberry Pi, and what he's talking about here is there's no switch to turn it on and off. How do you turn on a Raspberry Pi? To turn it on, you simply plug in the power cord, and it turns itself on. To power it off, you unplug the power cord. That's it. Now, for those of you used to traditional desktops and laptops, is that a big deal? Probably not, especially for a desktop. My desktop computer, I never power it off anyway, unless it's frozen up in some way I need to manually power it off. I just leave it running 24/7, 365. That's what I would do with the Pi if I was using it as a desktop replacement. As a laptop replacement, if I was taking the Pi various places, yeah, it's a little strange that you have to, the powering up just involves putting the power cord in. I guess that's a little strange, but I think you could get used to that. I don't think that's a big deal. Other considerations, of course, is the fact that if you buy the Raspberry Pi by itself, just the board, there's no case. You have to build a case or you have to buy a case separately, but I don't think that's a big deal either. You can buy a case for 20 or 30 bucks, some cheaper cases for the Raspberry Pi. If you are so inclined, you could build one yourself. So the bottom line here is the Raspberry Pi usable as a desktop replacement? According to J.A. Watson in the article, he says, Yes, the performance is good enough, the configuration is flexible enough, and the price is certainly right. And as an owner of a Raspberry Pi 3, I can say he's right. So 99% of desktop computer users could absolutely get by with using the Raspberry Pi 4 as their main desktop everyday computer, because most people are not going to do much that requires a ton of CPU power or a ton of RAM. Web browsing will require the most. The 2GB model, as far as 2GB of RAM, Raspberry Pi 4, is probably enough for 99% of computer users. And the fifth and final story on the docket tonight: trashed computers. So these computers that you throw away, you're throwing away a desktop, a laptop, you're throwing away your phones, various other electronic devices. It is very negatively impacting our environment. So this story comes from NS Business, written by Sam Fordstick. So, extending the lifespan of electrical goods such as your smartphones, washing machines, laptops could cut 10 million tons of CO2 emissions in the EU each year. So, extending the lifespan of these devices will greatly reduce CO2 emissions, which of course contributes to things like global climate change. So, these devices that have these short lifespans are really harming the environment. So if we could just extend the lifespan of these electrical products, he mentions, by 5 years, that could prevent 10 million tons of CO2 being pumped into the environment annually by the year 2030. If we could extend some of these devices, even as little as just 1 year, he mentions, if we could extend the lifespan by 1 year, that's the same as removing 2 million cars from European roads. So what's the big deal? Why are we having a problem with the lifespan of some of these devices? Why are your phones, especially, why is the phone such a big deal? Because there's billions of these billions with a B devices out there. How often do you get a new phone? Most people get a new phone for sure every 2 years, sometimes less than 2 years. I just got a new phone the other day because my old phone was having some issues. I didn't have that other phone for a year and a half. Part of the problem here is the manufacturers themselves. So think about, I've mentioned this many times on the program before, about planned obsolescence, especially with companies like Apple. Apple sells you the latest and greatest iPhone. You go out there and you buy the newest iPhone for $1,200. But Apple wants you to buy a new iPhone 2 years down the road for another $1,200. That's their business plan. The way they make money is to make that phone that they just sold you obsolete in a year or two down the road. That is the plan. Where does that old phone end up? Well, most of the time it ends up in the trash heap. And that is causing us major problem. When you have billions of devices, billions of smartphones and tablets and things like that out there, and they become obsolete very quickly, you're filling up these landfills with these devices. It's contributing to the CO2 emission. Another major problem with this is, I've also mentioned many times on the channel, is the right to repair. A lot of people are throwing away devices because they can't repair them. Companies are preventing you from repairing your own devices. The only person that can repair, I hate to pick on Apple, but let's use Apple again. The only person that can repair an Apple product is these people that are specially licensed by Apple that have the key to work on some of their devices. And that is part of the problem. If I can't repair my own device, if the repair cost from a licensed dealer is so high and I can't do anything to it myself, I'm prevented from actually doing anything. Yeah, I could open up the device, but without the right keys or anything, you really can't do anything. All I'm left with is throwing the device away. That's part of the problem. So planned obsolescence and the right to repair are really hurting the environment. So what is the solution? Well, I'm sure you guys know where I'm going with this. The solution is Linux, right? These old devices that no longer work, especially things like your old desktops, your old laptops. You have a laptop that's 10 years old that came with Windows 7 originally. Now it's slow and it's riddled with viruses. It's to the point where it's unusable. It takes 2 minutes for the web browser to open, right? And it's completely unusable. Most people take that device. What do? They throw it away. It goes to a recycle center. It goes maybe it goes to get refurbished, but it probably is going to end up in the trash heap. No, Linux can take that 10-year-old laptop and make it run like new again. You put the right Linux distro on some of these old machines, and they run better than they ran when they first came out with Windows all those years ago. Windows, or not Windows, oh my goodness, Linux can actually save the environment. These mobile devices, if you put the right mobile operating system, the right free and open source mobile operating system, Linux-based mobile operating system on them, again, you can extend the lifespan of these devices. You can get away from that cycle of planned obsolescence, and you can get away from that right to repair. I don't know if you can get away from that depending on the brand of phone, but Linux can really help us combat climate change. It's something I haven't explored that much on the channel. I probably should, because I think this is a bigger deal than what most people have considered. And that was the fifth and final story on the docket tonight. This was taking into account episode 50. As always, I like to read a viewer question or comment to end these episodes, but this week I'm not going to do that because I had hundreds, maybe thousands of viewer questions or comments about one topic. You guys probably can guess what that topic was. The whole Richard Stallman resigning from MIT and resigning from the Free Software Foundation topic. I made a couple of videos about those topics. I really shared all the opinion I had on that. I don't care one way or the other about Richard Stallman as far as his statements didn't offend me or anything. He's free to say whatever he thinks. I understand why MIT and the Free Software Foundation felt the need to pressure him into resigning. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I don't know how it's going to end up in the end, but I do know one thing. I am a member of the Free Software Foundation, and there are a lot of people spouting some pretty asinine things like, if Richard Stallman is not going to be a part of the Free Software Foundation, I'm out, right? I'm revoking my membership and I'm leaving. Okay. Richard Stallman was not the Free Software Movement. He never was the Free Software Movement. He founded the movement. But if the movement itself was Richard Stallman, then the Free Software Movement was never a viable movement to begin with. It just wasn't. Was Richard Stallman going to live forever? No. If he's a mortal human being, then he was at some point going to die anyway. And if you didn't think that this movement could live past him, then why are we even discussing it, right? No, this is bigger than Richard Stallman. It always was bigger than Richard Stallman. So whether you see him as a hero or whether you thought he was just a horrible person, it doesn't matter. The Free Software Movement was not Richard Stallman, but there's some people out there that do share that opinion, that without Richard, hey, if he's not in, I'm out. And I've seen people on the Free Software Foundation forums saying they were revoking their membership. They were no longer going to be a part of the Free Software Foundation if Stallman's not a part of it. And so to combat, I don't think it's going to be large numbers leaving the FSF. Maybe a few dozen, maybe a couple hundred. The FSF has over 4,000 active members right now, so a couple hundred people leaving. That is a big deal, though. That's a lot of money that the Free Software Foundation will lose, and we can't afford to lose the Free Software Foundation. So you guys that have been considering joining, please do so. Please click the membership tab over at fsf.org and consider joining as a regular member, or just donate to the project if you want to do a one-time donation. This is important. The Free Software Foundation is important, right? They're important for spreading awareness of free software. They're important for fighting evil things like DRM, digital rights management. Some of the stuff I just talked in that last story, things like planned obsolescence and the right to repair movement. You know, really nasty, evil things like that. The Free Software Foundation is out there fighting for you guys, each and every one of you. Even if you don't agree with the principles of the Free Software Movement, they don't care. They're still fighting for you. So if you've got a few bucks, please consider donating to them, because this is a weird time and transitioning from the leadership of Stallman and to potentially a new leader somewhere soon. I'm sure they'll announce a new president for the foundation. And I want to make this transition as smooth as possible for them. I hope you guys want this to go as smooth for them too. So if you got a few bucks, please consider donating. It is a worthwhile cause. Before I go, this show was made possible by Ansem, First Chris, Second Chris, DJ, Dylan, George, Mitchell, Natek, Philip, Rob, Robert, Sam, and Willie. They are the producers of the show, my highest tiered patrons over on Patreon. Without these guys, this show would not be possible. Show's also brought to you by all those other fine ladies and gentlemen, all those names you see on the screen that help support my work over on Patreon. Without these guys, again, taking into account episode 50 would not have been possible. If you'd like to contribute, please do so. You'll find me at DistroTube over on Patreon. All right, guys. Peace.